comes into our midst according to Matthew.
Glory to you, Lord.
Jesus said to the disciples, "When the human one comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate them one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will put the sheep at his right hand and the goats at the left. Then the king will say to those at his right hand, 'Come, you that are blessed by my Father. Inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me.' Then the just nations will answer him, 'Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you?' And the king will answer them, 'Truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me.' Then he will say to those at his left hand, 'You that are accursed, depart from me into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me. Naked, and you did not give me clothing. Sick and in prison, and you did not visit me.' Then they also will answer, 'Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or naked or sick or in prison and did not take care of you?' Then he will answer them, 'Truly I tell you, just as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me.' And these will go away into a time of punishment, but the just nations into life in God's new age." The gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
Please be seated. Growing up in my old neighborhood, Laurel Circle in Forest Park, Georgia, was a child's dream come true. There were enough children living on my street that it was easy to draft players for a pickup game of just about anything. Football or basketball, baseball or kickball, and one of our favorites, King of the Mountain. Find some perch, a hill, a cinder block, a large stump, anything with a little height, and push, pull, tackle, or fight until one person is left standing, the king of the mountain. Without exception, the victors of this game were always the big and strong. The strongest always won, until, that is, someone stronger came along and tore them from their throne. But that's just the way it was in our tiny part of the world. Yet this is true not just for the little neighborhood of Laurel Circle, it is true in the larger world too, right? The strongest, smartest, wealthiest, most privileged, most connected always seem to win. And if there are winners, then there must be losers. That's just the way it is. Isn't that what we see in today's gospel parable? Isn't Jesus simply affirming the way it is as he points to an apocalyptic day of the Lord's wrath? The ones who have gotten life right will be rewarded by God, and the ones who have messed up life will be punished by God. Is that the image of God's kingdom Jesus is illustrating for us? An image of a kingdom where one final day there will be a decisive selection of winners and losers, insiders and outsiders? Well, let's look a little more closely at the text and see whether this is the case or not. How about pulling out your pew Bible? Right there in the rack, pew rack in front of you. And turn with me to page 807. Page 807. And you'll find there Matthew chapter 25. It's on the right-hand column. It begins with the 31st verse, the right-hand column of page 807. It's got the telling title, The Judgment of the Nations. If you listen closely and followed along as I read the gospel for today, you likely noticed I changed a few words. Critical among those changes is one little word in verse 32. So if we'll look at verse 32, it reads, "All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats." Now just kind of hold your place there, keep a finger there. That one little word translated people is actually the Greek plural pronoun autos, which means them. Autos, them, refers back to the subject in the first clause, all the nations. Now for years, I have heard this text interpreted as an end-time judgment of individual people, a sorting of individual people into sheep and goats, the good and the bad, winners and losers, eternally blessed insiders and eternally damned outsiders. But correcting just that one little word, translating it as them, that is, as the nations instead of people, changes everything. Changes everything by keeping the major action where Jesus intended. See, for Jesus, it's not about individuals. It's about a whole body of people, the polis, the whole nation. It's not about a judgment on you and your individual charitable actions with regards to the least of these. Jesus is illustrating a judgment on the nation, the polis, and whether it has chosen justice or whether it has continued to build its empire, especially build its empire through violence. I mean, think about it. When humans evaluate nations, we tend to do so on the basis of wealth and power, right? What's the gross domestic product? What's the standard of living? What's the strength of the economy, the strength of the military? I mean, remember, for us, the strong always win. The strong become king of the mountain. But this is not the criteria Jesus uses to judge the nations. Not the criteria he uses as he sits upon his glorious throne as the king. Look back with me at Matthew 25. Find verses 35 and 36. As we see here, Jesus judges the nations on how well they care for four kinds of people. First, the poor. I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. The sick. I was sick, and you took care of me. The immigrant. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. The prisoner. I was in prison, and you visited me. As you can see, for Jesus and the kingdom of God, it's a whole different set of criteria. It's as if Christ or God says, oh, your nation, your polis, has a strong gross national product. Great. But how did you get there? Are you using slave labor or underpaid workers? Or do you offer a living wage? Your economy is strong? Wonderful. But is the wealth staying with the wealthy? Or is everyone benefiting from a robust economy? Is there quality, affordable housing for everyone, including the homeless? Do your sick have access to affordable quality health care? In your polis, are refugees and immigrants welcomed and cared for, or are there barriers that keep them from finding safe sanctuary? Is your prison system just and equitable in how it delivers its judgment and punishment? Did your nation or polis build its empire on military might Did it become king of the mountain through military, economic, and or political strength? Does your nation believe in or trust its military strength to save it? Its economic superiority to save it? Its political prowess to make or keep it great? These are the criteria Jesus uses to evaluate the polis. Polis, that old Greek word for the city-state, the root of our modern word, politics. Yes, Jesus is being political, but that's because he cares about the life of the polis, the city-state and its citizens, its ethos, and yes, its politics. Besides, Jesus, according to the evangelist Matthew, has been political all along. Keep your finger at Matthew 25 and turn back to the beginning of the gospel according to Matthew. Find page 784. In the left-hand column, it says the escape to Egypt, right? So from the very beginning, that maniacal tyrant king, Herod, is threatened by Jesus. He feels a political threat to his kingdom from Jesus, this infant who has been born. And so he sends his army to massacre the infants of Bethlehem. And Jesus has to escape his tyrant ways. Then look at page 785, chapter 4, the temptation of Jesus. The devil takes Jesus and puts him on a high mountain and shows him the kingdoms of the world, and he tempts Jesus to take those kingdoms and to rule over them, and probably by force. Look at the bottom right of page 785, the Beatitudes. There on the mountain, Jesus is teaching the disciples and the crowd, and he's declaring that those who are blessed with the kingdom are the least of these, not the strong or wealthy. Finally, it's also from another mountain in chapter 25, if you flip back there. It's this time the Mount of Olives, looking out over Jerusalem, that polis, that Jesus teaches the disciples again, this time in parable form. And Jesus is warning the nations that there are consequences to behaving as empires have done throughout human history. The nation who has become king of the mountain by neglecting justice in favor of systemic violence that neglects or sacrifices the vulnerable, that nation will fall, will fail. As such, these times of fallenness are a time of fire, a time of punishment, not brought on directly by God, but the consequences of how God has created the world. These times of failure are the consequences of us not living as we are created to live, not living as citizens of God's kingdom. We are created to live as a beloved community, making sure we take care of the least among us, the most vulnerable. To not live in this way is to fail our own humanity. Our true human community is a sheep, and our failed human community is a goat. This is not an eternally determined reality, but something worked out in the ebb and flow of history. When we form the polis, the nation, the community, like a bunch of kids pushing, pulling, tackling, and fighting to be king of the mountain, that is in ways founded in violence or neglect of the least of these, then we will suffer times of tasting our own medicine, the fire of violence. But God's kingdom is founded in mercy, forgiveness, compassion, nonviolence, and love, by a king who let himself fall victim to an empire's violence, executed on a cross on a mount outside of Jerusalem. This true king of the mountain, Jesus, the true king in history, then defeated our violence, death, and the grave when God raised him to usher in a new age and a new politic, a new way of being community. As citizens of God's polis, we are free to reject the politics of hate, separation, fear, judgment, greed, and violence. As subjects of the true King, we are free to strive to be great in love, mercy, forgiveness, compassion, forming the beloved community. This is what God promises, God's great initiative. This is what we hope and strive for, this new thing God is doing. It's a great leveling, a great equalizing, a new age that is coming, indeed, that has already begun, when the world will turn toward God's version of justice. Tyrant kings of mountains will be torn from their thrones. The hungry poor will weep no more. The spear and the rod will be crushed by God, and there will be no winners or losers, for the world will turn to follow the loving way of the true King, and all will stand together on the King's mountain. Amen.